Energy plays a key role in many, if not almost all, parts of our daily life, from the transport we use to reach our friends or to go to work, to the heating in our homes, to the same video that we are watching nowadays. But energy is not just consumption and production, but is also security, politics, geopolitics, international relations. And we will discuss all of this with our guest, Joan MacNaughton. Thanks a lot for being here, Joan, first of all.
Thank you for having me.
And today we are in London, so it's part of this moving Europe. We are outside Brussels for the third time. And Joan is one of the top UK energy experts. She was a Director General at the UK Department of Industry and Trade, but also chair of main global bodies like the International Energy Agency. For the audience, if you could explain, like in a straightforward and simple manner, why is important energy politics today? What would you say?
Well, what I'd say, and I hope this will be comprehensible to everybody, is that without reliable and affordable energy, there is no economic security. And social cohesion becomes very vulnerable if you don't have economic security. So in these circumstances, I would argue that the need for secure and affordable energy is key and core to national life for us. Just one other point while we're talking about this is that for many countries, they aren't yet started very fast on the clean energy transition, and pollution is a dreadful problem from the fossil fuels in particular. And for example, when I was working on issues affecting global issues, I was very struck by a figure that around about 2010, something like 3% of China's GDP was spent on dealing with the consequences, the health consequences of pollution, most of it from dirty energy sources. So to have a prosperous society, at peace with itself, we all need to care about energy politics. And of course, apart from that, we're now facing the existential threat of climate change. So we have to embark on the clean energy transition and deal with all the emissions from energy use and other uses, of course, that are contributing to the challenge of climate change.
You mentioned several different priorities, so secure energy, affordable energy, now you even said clean energy. What you would be interested in, since you've been working in this field for several decades already, did you notice changes in the way we're discussing about these challenges? In another way to say it, did the priorities over the last decades change in energy politics?
Well, I think I'd say two things there. First of all, the understanding of how important energy is has moved up the agenda to an astonishing degree. And if I can look at my own government in the UK, there were at one stage, when I became Director General of Energy, there were very differing views about how important energy was. You know, it was just another area of production and consumption, to use your words. But our Prime Minister at the time was very clear about how vital it was and was an early leader in relation to climate change. So one of my first tasks was to deliver a new strategy for energy, which was the 2003 White Paper, as we called it. And that put climate change at the heart of energy policy. And I think that was the first time any major developed economy had linked those two goals in that way. Then if we move forward to 2005, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, succeeded in putting onto the agenda of the then G8 summit at Gleneagles in 2005, he put climate change and the need for the clean transition on the agenda. And I have to say, some of the other members of the G8 were not keen on this, but he, at that time, was very determined, and he managed to prevail. It's not only the UK who's been seeing this. I think there's been a great evolution in understanding the challenges of energy provision, its centrality to our lives, and the linkage with climate change. You know, we were, as a continent, we were dependent on Russian gas, and we still are a little bit dependent on Russian gas, but not as much as we were. And we thought at that stage that it was in the interests of Russia to continue to be a reliable supplier, and we did not take a more strategic view to diversifying our sources of energy supply and the routes by which it reached us. Actually, the UK, partly because it didn't have pipelines to Russia and partly because it had the UK sources of gas, did take that view, again in that white paper I mentioned. We developed a lot of different import points. So I think, you know, that we have come to realise that you cannot be dependent on a single source of supply for energy. You cannot be dependent on a single country to meet other of your needs. And we're seeing that play out in various other ways now, which I'm sure we'll come on to. So I would say that Europe's priorities have, the priorities in terms of what people want to deliver for their populations have not changed. But the understanding of how you do that has changed quite a lot. And with that change has come some very significant policy development.
And I think what's clear is that in the last 20-25 years, we have come a long way in the different areas, and we'll touch on several of those now. Maybe let's start with the area of the link between energy transition and climate change. We know that today of Europe's electricity production, there is around 47% share of renewables, and this is up, I think, in the last 5 years from 38%. So there has already been quite some significant advancement. At the same time, we know that fossil fuels still do make up a sizable share. So my question is also taking into the consideration our climate goals, the EU's climate goals, Europe's climate goals. Is the pace of shifting to renewables quick enough in your view?
Well, the first point, if you'll forgive me, is to say that renewables have a crucial role to play, but so do some other technologies. And whether you count it as renewable or not, I think most people don't. Nuclear has a role to play. I hope we're going to discuss that. Secondly, you're absolutely right. We can't just flick a switch and stop using fossil fuels. We need the technologies. We need to replace our capital base. In fact, not just in the electricity sector, but, you know, in the transport sector, our industrial processes, or whatever. And so we can't do that overnight. It's got to be a managed transition. But there is one technology that can help us to manage that transition more effectively that people tend somewhat to overlook, and that's carbon capture, use and storage. Again, in the work we did in the UK government, we did a lot of modelling work about what it would take to get to our ambitions for the 2050 level of emissions, which at that stage we thought were ambitious, 50%. We thought that was ambitious. And the modelling made it clear that if you ruled out nuclear and CCS, as we called it then, this would be not only unaffordable, but virtually impossible to achieve. So that's my first point. The second point on pace is that you may remember, or maybe you're not old enough to remember as I am, the ambition in the 2020 directive at European level, which I think was finally enacted in 2008, for 20% of energy to come from renewable sources by 2020. and a 20% increase in our efficient use of energy. And, that's, again, another source that people tend to underestimate. At that point, that seemed like a big stretch. But you've just explained that here we are, we've got, nearly 50% of our electricity use. We've got other uses of renewables in addition to electricity, and other uses of energy for heating and transport and so forth. So the pace is not quick enough at the moment, but it has accelerated a lot. And I think it illustrates that you mustn't assume that you can only achieve in the future what you've been achieving up to now. I mean, the technologies evolve, the costs come down, the ability to learn from those technologies and the acceptance of those technologies all grow over time, and with that, so should our ambition. But I think you're absolutely right that pace is now crucial. And pace is crucial because, when markets change, normally they're driven by economics and fashion, let's be honest. But here we have a ticking clock, which is climate change. And that's not going to tick more slowly because we are a bit slower in doing what we need to do.
Especially also because now, if we see the new targets are that we want to achieve 69% renewables by 2030, which would be, again, 20% more. So, again, very ambitious.
Indeed. And, if a target is set and it's ambitious enough, and then we just fail, I would argue that target has still been a success. Because without that pull from the target, which can drive policy, drive understanding, drive the market and the economics of the technologies, then you wouldn't have got even to the level that you have attained.
Yeah, and here, so we need to move, and we need to move fast. Indeed, you mentioned this ticking time bomb of climate change. But the aspect here that I think is not very clear in the public debate is that, of course, you have like non-renewable energies, like as coal, fuel, oil, and renewable energies like solar and wind, and you have these intermediate probably sources, transitional, that can be natural gas or nuclear, but we don't have that much time in order to achieve the climate objectives. So in your view, and also in the white paper that you developed in 2003, is it necessary to phase out from fossil fuels, passing through also these intermediate energy sources like nuclear, or you would envisage that it would be better to pass directly from fossil fuels and focus more directly on renewable sources?
Well, the first thing I'd say is to note that nuclear could become part of the steady state in the long term. So although some people may prefer to see it as a transitional technology, and it may turn out to be, depending on how things evolve, it could have a place in the energy mix in the future. There's a lot going on in relation to fission reactors, how we deploy them. We are struggling to do them well and quickly and cost effectively, but China has done it. One of the things that would help there is the new technologies of what are called small modular reactors. They're not that small, actually. I mean, about 4 of them would be as big as one of the big baseload thermal plants. But there's no doubt that the techniques that you could use and the nuclear technology inherent in the SMRs could give you some progress there. And then you've got the big potential prize of nuclear fusion. Now, that's not going to be a significant contributor to our emissions targets by 2050, if at all. And it may not be viable. It's not because the fundamental science is wrong, it is that actually to ensure that you can do it with the kind of materials and containment you need to deliver, it may be that you can't actually produce a worthwhile net energy gain. The energy you have to use may not deliver, but in theory it could, and a lot of people are investing a lot to see. So that's a kind of technology which could be more promising. With gas, I'd say that's slightly different. We know that it creates a lot of emissions, and it's not just the CO2 emissions when it's burnt, it's the emissions when it's being produced. And we have been far too slow in addressing that issue. We now have efforts globally, partly as a result of one of the UN meetings, the COPs, to tackle methane, and the technologies exist, and in theory that ought to be completely affordable and actually positive for the economics of gas use. But it hasn't happened, and frankly, people are making more money being slightly careless about methane escapes than the management time, if I can put it that way, and the investment to really deliver on elimination of methane leaks. So that's the first point I'd make on gas. The second point is I think it needs to play a role, and it will play a role over the next few decades. But we have to be really careful, because there are those who want to use that contribution that gas is going to make essentially to just prolong the market for gas and oil as fossil fuels. And I think there's a lot of vested interest in trying to deliver on that. And that leads people to set up a false antithesis between renewables and fossil fuels, a false antithesis between economic prosperity and using the technologies to deliver on the clean transition. And we can see that consensus has been slightly weakened, although I think in most developed countries, even in the US, a majority of people recognise that climate change has to be tackled, and to do that we need to invest in the clean transition. There are different views in individual member states of the European Union, and that is fine. I do not see it being really feasible, or even, I would argue, desirable for the EU to take control and deny the autonomy of individual member states to make their choices on their energy sources, because each one starts with the inheritance they've got, and each one has their particular needs and requirements. And frankly, I think that should be seen as a position of strength, not of weakness, because these can be all complementary if you get the infrastructure right, having that variety of sources. But that is, we would say let 1,000 flowers bloom, but that is conditional on those who do not wish to have nuclear in their own individual territories, to be tolerant of the rest of the European Union, which wants to go down that route. And it is, there are lots of individual policies which flow from that. But one of the key ones is that if you have good connectivity, frankly, nobody knows whether an electron is a nuclear-produced electron or a hydro-produced electron or a wind-produced electron, and it shouldn't matter in terms of the overall stability of the European Union energy system, if I can put it that way. And even, I would say, the European energy system, including the EU, because we are interconnected. Including the UK, because we are interconnected.
Maybe I can just ask a quick follow-up question on this, because, of course, you said that there are different energy transition in the different member states. For instance, we know that France relies very heavily on nuclear, and I understand that for those countries it makes sense to continue with the nuclear path at least for a while. But for those countries who currently do not rely on nuclear, do you think it would still make sense in investing in future nuclear capacities, or does this not make much sense in your view?
Well, I think it's up to them to make the decision, and I think we may see some shifts in that regard. Who knows? But it wouldn't surprise me if Germany comes to believe that their decisions on phasing out nuclear capacity before the end of its useful life maybe should be revisited. But if any particular country doesn't feel that that's where their population is placed, then that is fine, and that should be completely up to them, and nobody should be second-guessing the democratic will in that country. But equally, the countries who are in that position shouldn't be second-guessing the democratic will of France or the UK or Belgium or whoever to go down the increase in nuclear capacity or the sustaining of nuclear capacity. Nuclear is not a silver bullet. It's not without flaws. No energy source has total upside and no downside. It's all about the trade-offs, and individual countries should seek to make the best trade-offs they can in terms of their political consensus, in terms of their economic condition, in terms of their legacy systems. But if you take all of the different countries together and you put in the enabling infrastructure flexibly to manage demand and supply across that space, that can be to everybody's benefit.
But what are in your opinion, then the main downsides of nuclear energy? Because you have a lot of advantages, indeed, that is a stable energy source. Also, it is not that much subject to market volatility, and is also low emission based. So like the downsides, because in the public debate also in Italy it's heavily debated nuclear, and there is a lot of resistance from the public. In your opinion, from where does it come from mainly?
One interesting thing in the UK is that we have segments of opinion who are against nuclear, and that is they're entitled to that view. But when you come to build a new nuclear power station, people who live near them want the jobs and the development that a replacement would bring in their area. So what that says to me is that maybe one of the issues is familiarity versus unfamiliarity. If you've never had it, or if memory is about an accident or about the military use, then maybe that is a factor in people's minds. There is still an issue over waste, although both Sweden and Finland have strategies on managing the waste. Again, this is an area where technology will help. But frankly, the idea that we can now go back in the foreseeable future to what some of us hoped some years ago we were moving towards, which is a world where you manage down the military use of nuclear, I think that has gone. And I feel particularly sorry for Ukraine, who gave up their nuclear capability, their military nuclear capability, on the basis of promises that their sovereignty would be respected. And those promises were given, frankly, by a lot of Europeans, by the US and by Russia. So I think with that example in mind, people are not going to be so quick to urge their governments to give up nuclear autonomy. I would also point out that in Australia, for example, there was a very strong consensus against military use of nuclear, and they're now part of a pact with the UK and the US on nuclear-powered submarines. And this is a very uncertain world in which we live now.
Yeah, and here I think you touch very interesting points, because I think there is also a mismatch between the objective science and evidence and the public perception in terms of energy policy, climate policy. Before we were referring to the US, and I think it's very interesting because there is more awareness about climate change, but you have around 99% of scientific journals that do agree on the fact that climate change is caused by humans. But on the other hand, the public perception, for example, among the Republicans, just a minority believes that climate change is driven by human activities. So in your career, did you see a lot of this alignment between what is the objective truth in science and what is the public perception? There were cases where you have seen that evidence and the objective best energy solution was not adopted for some political calculus?
Yes, I have seen that, and I'd make 2 points on that. There's been some very interesting research in the 2000s, up to 2010, about attitudes to nuclear and about how when people were presented with what was believed to be the best science, how they interpreted that and the conclusions they drew were not purely scientific. It all depended on your values, your starting position. Mm-hmm. And we all interpret the world through our starting values. And this is as true of energy and climate change as of anything else. So that's the first point I'd make. And I dare say if you repeated some of that research in relation to climate change, you would find exactly the same thing. So it's not enough just to get the science out there. Mm. You have to be persuasive in the way that you produce the narrative about what is happening and what needs to be done. Having said that, of course, people's own experience of climate change is growing all the time. Sadly, we're all seeing the impacts. We know that spring comes 3 weeks earlier in the UK. The farmers know it, who might traditionally have been a slightly, dare one say, more conservative group. The second point I'd make is if a particular group with good resources and good access to sympathetic media consistently pushes a line of thought, then some people are going to be persuaded, even if that flies in the face of the science. There's a reason that companies spend a lot of money on advertising. Yeah. And it is that people can be persuaded, and maybe you do think that this is a miracle ingredient where even if you eat more of it you'll lose weight. People are influenceable. Yeah. So it is very much in our interests, and dare I say the interests of communicators like yourselves, to try to not only to get the science out there, but to explain it in a way that is accessible and persuasive.
Yeah, and here one very striking example is we pass, for example, in the US from the Biden administration with the largest investment in history of the US in renewable energies to the Trump administration with a comeback to fossil fuels. And there it's also important to understand how the political momentum can change very quickly, as how politics change quickly. And also in the European Union, we are seeing a lot of criticism as well coming from some political party and also influential politicians to the EU Green Deal, to the investments in renewables. In your opinion, like in the future, do you think which narrative will prevail? Do we will see a coming back of political consensus to fossil fuels, in your opinion?
I don't think so. Okay. But I think the reasons I say that are that people see the impacts of climate change. I think the understanding of that is one of the most definite changes that I've seen in this area over the last 20 years. That's my first point. The second point is I used to say when I was talking to groups that time is not on our side in tackling climate change, but demography is on our side, because actually younger people are more likely to get it and they're more likely to see what needs to be done to address climate change. Now, the second thing I'd say is that actually we are not far away from tipping points on the economics of a lot of the renewable solutions and other clean solutions. I was looking at a report by the University of Exeter and others, which shows that if you look at EU, US, India, China, the tipping point at which renewable electricity, renewable transport becomes cheaper than the marginal cost basis of the fossil fuels. That is to say, even when you account for the upfront investment. Yeah. Now, that is very significant, that is going to happen by 2030. That is calculated to happen by 2030, and maybe a little bit later for things like heat, although some of that is because of distortions in the pricing, and that we haven't fully applied the costs of pollution, etc., to the fossil fuels. A lot of companies get this. A lot of business, even in the US, is embarked on a journey to get to net zero. They won't be shouting about it to the same degree that they were because of the differing views now. But, you know, I work with companies. I've sat on boards. I still sit on some boards. And they know that this is what they need to do. They're investing a lot of money in it. And in very large measure, they can see the economic justification for doing that. Yeah. And that's before you take into account that you don't want to be dependent on the petrostates. Not to mention the volatility of fossil fuel prices.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to hear that the economic case for renewables becomes, as you say, stronger and stronger up to a point to potentially reach this tipping point. But of course there are other obstacles. No, for instance, we know that the permitting procedures in Europe are in part extremely long. So for instance, for wind parks, it's up between 5 and 7 years, I think, on average in the EU. Now, there were some measures taken, like in the Renewable Energy Directive, which introduced binding targets, maximum 1 to 2 years, depending on the area. Do we already see the impact of those measures on the ground? You mentioned that you worked with some companies. Do we see that things are moving quicker?
I think it's beginning to move more quickly, but I don't think it's completely got the traction it needs to have yet. And there is a lot you can do in terms of the process by streamlining the procedures, by improving the processes, recruiting enough administrators to actually get these things through without delay. I mean, that is a big frustration for companies, actually, because companies, when they want to do something, tend to put the resources there to make it happen. It's more difficult for the public sector often to make those shifts, but that could happen, and it really needs to happen. You could standardise regulatory frameworks. I remember when I used to be, I was actually the regulator for the North Sea, and one of the ways we took cost out of oil and gas recovery in the UK was to standardise the procedures between the UK and Norway, because some of the fields crossed the territory. And actually, anything you can do to standardise takes a lot of cost and delay out. Now, the other thing that you could do is address the issue of local concerns, because people justifiably are worried about a change near to them. A house is most people's biggest single economic asset. And how is it going to affect me to have this particular development near my house? That could be more housing, it could be renewables, it could be a power station, it could be a road. And we have to get better at addressing those concerns, and you can do it without adding hugely to cost. I still believe that if you could get people on side through economic incentives, overall there could be net gain. You don't have to take much delay out of the process to change the calculation on the cost of capital for the investor. You get the public interest. Maybe some of this could be time limited or very specific to certain projects, but then people do adjust. I mean, I mentioned nuclear before. I heard an item on the radio a couple of weeks ago. People were taking boat trips out to the North Sea to look at offshore wind farms because they thought that was a beautiful thing to do. Tourists going to see offshore wind farms. You know, the total opposition changes to acceptance as people get used to it, because none of us lives in a sterile bubble. Actually, things change around us. So I think there are things we can do, and I think actually the EU has a particular role to play in encouraging member states to standardise and streamline, particularly as some of these things will have cross-border implications.
Definitely.
Yeah. And here I think indeed the impact of harmonization on decreasing cost is also something that is overlooked sometimes in the public debate. How important it is to be harmonized from a business perspective, for example in the EU economy, and how much this will change indeed what we just mentioned before, so the speed of implementing renewable projects. And in this regard there is a lot that concerns also energy policies, and we would like to touch upon grids and the importance of having adequate infrastructure, because we are going to invest in solar and wind, and we need to double down the capacity on solar investments and in wind to significantly increase as well. But for example in Germany, in the Netherlands, we have like around 200 gigawatts of projects that are blocked because we do not have adequate grid infrastructure. So there we put the EU Smart Grid Action Plan. In your opinion, looking also at Germany, Netherlands, what's happening now, are we doing enough, or are we not risking to invest in solar and wind, and then at the moment of implementation we lack the infrastructure?
Well, it's a really good point, because the globe is littered with examples of wind and solar which producing electricity that cannot be used. China made this mistake and is now rectifying it. Of course, in China, there is they have more power to impose central planning, and so that can help. But actually, they would admit that they have lost power they could have used by focusing on the build of the sources without looking across the piece at the connectivity, not just to the grid, but the connectivity of different parts of the grid to the rest of that huge country. So in cost terms, it's incredible, and it's incredible how much you can save in emission terms, because every time you're not using wind source, you're using more fossil to meet the demand. So these curtailment costs, as we describe them, they're a quick win, both for costs and for emissions reduction. And so I would say that increased connectivity is essential for security, as well as for the clean transition. And we should have more focus on that. I'd make two other points in relation to the grid, though. One is we must get serious about how artificial intelligence, AI, can help with increasing grid flexibility. There's huge underused potential there. The second point is equally seriously, we have to pay a lot of attention to cyber risk, the risk of cyber, hostile cyber activity, whether that be from state actors or other bad actors. So both of those need a great deal of attention. But if we can get that right, then what I was saying earlier about the strength of having different sources of supply in different parts of the continent and different demand peaks, because we do have some differences in when demand peaks, east to west particularly, but even north to south when, we're looking at weather impacts, then we can make best use of the totality of the sources.
And you mentioned how important it is to ensure that the grid remains stable. You said we could explore using AI more. I think a month ago or 1.5 months ago, there was this massive blackout in the Iberian Peninsula. Even though now it seems that this was not due to cyber attacks or anything similar, what was often argued is that more cross-country connections of the grid would have help the situation. So could you maybe explain for somebody who's not really an expert in the field why cross-country connections of the grid are so important?
Well, it increases resilience, because if you have a problem in one part of the grid, what happens is you can draw on power from another to compensate, as it were. I'm trying to think of an analogy, really. I suppose if you think of water and you have one part of the country has terrible drought, then what you might do is you might put water in tankers and take it down and give people at least a minimum level of access, if you've got a real problem. So it's the electricity equivalent of that, except that electrons are much easier to transport if you've got the grid infrastructure than water is. I mean, electrons are one of the most mobile things you can have. So that connectivity was really be a bonus for everybody. The point is that you every individual country carries its reserve, of extra capacity to cope with peaks. But most of the time, it's mostly not used. So if there is a problem in one area and you're all connected, the electricity can flow to that area. And AI and other grid flexibility management techniques can help you with that. We haven't touched on another important area which helps with all of this and helps with the move away from big dirty sources of electricity in particular, and that's storage. And the techniques on storage, the battery techniques in particular, for what are called utility scale storage. So that's not just the battery in my house or your house, but the battery that might, help give you a couple of hours of supply across a whole city or similar. They are evolving to be more deployable and more cost effective. And other techniques are coming on as well. I mean, we're thinking obviously about the role that green hydrogen might play, which would substitute for gas storage, which we have relied on quite understandably in the past. Things like flywheels. So again, if most countries have some storage, and they don't all need it at the time, and one country or one region, shall I say, has a lot of need for that storage, then that can keep the flows going through the electricity system if you get the connections right. There is another point, which is the cost of producing electricity varies according to the peaks. So actually, having interconnection helps people arbitrage to the cheapest source of electricity at any point. So more connectivity should actually bring total costs down.
And on the aspect of connectivity, storage, I would like also to focus on transport, which is one of the most important aspects, of course, of pollution and emissions. And one study that I found particularly interesting was about cars, where it has been estimated that individuals, they use their cars for 5% of the time. 5%, meaning that like a car is something that 95% is unused, and cars, I mean, it emits not just at the moment of using it, like on the road, but also when you have it parked, no?
And also when you build it.
Yes, true. Exactly. And even if we move to electric vehicles, you still have like the impact on emission on building these cars that are used 5% of the time. So do you think the European Union and the UK and Europe as a whole should make more of an effort on trying to share these good cars to instead of private ownership, or is it utopistic to have the idea of sharing more cars instead of just purchasing and having them as individual households? And what will be the impact on emissions if we move towards a more efficient usage of cars?
I think it's happening anyway. I think some people have seen an opportunity to build a good business model from renting facilities. I mean, where I live, not only can you rent a car, and there are cars parked around that you can choose to rent. You can rent an e-scooter, you can rent an e-bike. My local council, local government, has a scheme where you can rent tools, expensive tools, instead of buying an electric drill that you use twice a year. You pay £5 and you can use it for a weekend. So this is happening. Again, it's driven by economics. Can governments do more to encourage and facilitate this kind of sharing? Of course they can. You know, I remember the first time I went to the US on business. I've been there as a tourist, but the first time I went on business in the mid-90s, they had a special lane for commuters if they were in what they called a high occupancy vehicle. That is, if you gave your colleague a lift into town on the Monday and he gave you a lift in on the Tuesday, or she gave you a lift in on the Tuesday. So, you know, that sharing was already seen as a way of cutting congestion, cutting commuting times for everyone, because you're speeding up the flow. But that was a great incentive to give them a priority lane, and things like priority lanes for buses, which we have. But there are other things you could do. Don't have time to go into the detailed policy tools. A lot of them are actually nil or cost or even positive financially.
So Joan, now we talked about mainly the climate-related aspects of the energy transition, but we would also like to focus on the geopolitical elements. And it is often argued in this context that Europe's strategy post-World War II was to rely on three pillars: protection from the US militarily, free trade as a second pillar, and as a third pillar, cheap energy from Russia. Now, all of these three elements appear to be slowly crumbling. So I would be interested in your perspective. How important was access to Russian gas for Europe's economy? And in other words, how much of modern Europe is really built on Russian gas?
Well, I was really interested to see this question because I never thought of it in that way. And I actually would like to question the premise under it. I mean, I completely accept on the free trade and the US military support. They have both been crucial. Access to cheap fossil energy, well, coal was really important. But Russian gas, maybe this predates my time in this sector. I came into the energy and climate space in 2002, but I don't think it's so key for Europe. I mean, apart from anything else, you have a very variegated pattern of energy use across the EU. There are countries that have huge hydro resources. There are countries that have been early to the game on nuclear. Maybe calling it a game isn't the right thing, but early to the use of nuclear, and you have the big dependence on coal. So I'm not sure it has been so key. And even with Russian gas, I haven't had time to go back and research this before the time when I came into this area, but my understanding since 2002 onwards is that actually EU gas prices have always been higher. Well, fossil fuel prices, maybe not just gas, but gas and oil, have always been higher than the US. Admittedly, Asia is higher because, frankly, gas has three distinct regional markets. It's got Asia, it's got Europe, and it's got the US. And I would think that it hasn't been such a huge factor and is getting much reduced, partly because of the efforts to move away from Russian gas and partly because of the increasing significance of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is bought on the spot market. Now, long-term contracts for pipeline gas could be struck quite cheaply, but then when you strike them, you're making a judgment about the way the market's going to go in the future. And some of those contracts turned out not to be as cheap as people thought. They also contained restrictive clauses. The Russian contracts particularly contained clauses preventing you from selling on the Russian gas. So you had to take or pay for it. Now, that suggests to me it wasn't a one-way street on benefits. So I don't think myself that it was foundational. It may have made a contribution, but I think there are lots of other reasons that the EU economy thrived, and I actually think the evolution of the Union since the foundation of the coal and steel community has been a big factor in Europe's prosperity.
Yeah, and considering the relation between the EU and Russia, clearly in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and both the EU and Western allies, among which the UK, decided to undertake a strategy to phase out Russian gas completely in the following years. And while from a political perspective now clearly looking at the relationship between the West and Russia, it is not needed to discuss if it makes sense or not, but economically, in your opinion, is it good and advantageous for the EU to disconnect from Russian gas?
Well, I don't think you can separate out the economics from the politics. We are in a situation where a near neighbour has been invaded and where atrocities are being committed, frankly. And we have to take a decision about how much that matters to us and what will happen next if that sort of activity goes unchecked and is seen to have a payoff. So I don't think you can separate those two off. And there will be some cost to that. There is some cost to that in terms of increased defence spending, which most European countries have decided is essential, and I think would have decided was essential, maybe not so quickly, even without the pressure from the United States. So, and I personally have changed my mind quite a lot on that. I was really not in favour of a lot of diversion of resources to defence spending, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, but I'm in no doubt at all now what needs to happen. So that's just my opinion, but I think the way in which policy is going suggests that it is the will of those countries as represented by their governments. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point is that Russia has shown itself to be an unreliable supplier. I think attitudes changed quite a lot after the cutting off of gas supply to Belarus in 2004. And by the way, then subsequent cutting off of supplies to Ukraine to 2005, 2006. In each case, there were complicating factors, including disputes over who was using the gas and whether there was fulfillment of contractual commitments on both sides. And I'm not suggesting we go there. But if you resolve a contractual dispute, not by going to arbitration, but just unilaterally by cutting off supply, then I think anybody who's going to buy large quantities of that commodity from you in the future should be pretty cautious. And I think actually it did affect the views of some countries on things like renewables and nuclear. I think it actually affected the level of consensus. There was a consensus, but I think it nudged the needle a bit more. Can it be done without untold economic damage? Yes. I mean, it's not going to be painless, but I think it is conceivable, and the way in which the European countries have chosen to do it, which is a combination of reducing the use of Russian gas and applying a cap to the price of Russian oil, is the right approach. And we see lots of areas in which dependency is reducing. You know, you look at Norway, I mean, 95% or something of vehicles sold in Norway were electric last year. So there are things you can do, and they help with the transition. They will help with security of supply in the future, and they actually will help with economic competitiveness, because the costs of these technologies are coming down, and it is really crucial that we have autonomy in the production and use of these technologies ourselves, and that's going to be central to the European economic future.
Yeah, and here I would like just to touch upon a point that we also touched with our previous guest, so I think it's also interesting to see the different perspective. You mentioned Russia as being an unreliable supplier also several times in the past, and I would like to understand here also at the time of the white paper, and the EU and the UK heavily rely on Russian gas almost as the sole supplier source, but Russia has a track record also of international law behavior not aligned or not in line indeed with what you expect from a reliable partner. So what were the considerations at the time? Were we hoping as EU and UK that it will not happen to us, or can you walk us a bit through this?
Yeah. I cast my mind back to one of the principles on security of supply in that white paper was diverse sources of supply through different technologies and through different routes. So we, following on from that, agreed a huge contract with Gatterer, which was just developing its LNG export model, which came in to Europe in West Wales. And if you think about it, actually, that's not a bad place to come in, because you're coming right round the edge of Europe. It comes in there, and then it can either go into the UK gas grid and be re-exported through connectors to Europe, or you can truck it, or you can take the ship from there. But primarily the first. So that contract happened during my time. We had a contract with, when I say we, the companies had contracts, but the government gave regulatory approval. We had contracts with Egypt for supply of LNG. So we really built up our LNG. And although our own gas production was reducing, and we ceased to be a net exporter in about 2004, 2005 from the UK continental shelf, we actually were a re-exporter because of these other sources that were coming into us. So I don't think we've ever been that reliable on Russian gas. But what we have been, and this illustrates another point that we've been talking about, is we were a price taker during the winter of, I think it was 2004, when there was a real, there was a very cold winter, the gas market was tight globally, and we ended up taking imports of gas from continental Europe, who had better individual storage resources than we had. And so we paid more than we would have done if we'd kept our storage up. And what we hadn't adjusted enough for was seasonality, because we were fine in the summer, but in the winter we hadn't given ourselves enough of a buffer, because at that point we were still consuming, the majority of our consumption was domestic supply, which is more than any storage you can have, frankly. You're not going to have the majority, but you needed it to get over peaks, short-term peaks during the winter. So that was a valuable lesson, and it isn't one that we have learnt effectively enough in relation to gas, given how dependent the UK has been on gas for heating. We have to move away from that. The economics of using gas for heating versus electricity through heat pumps are bizarre. And the only reason the market hasn't driven that is that we price our electricity, really it's driven by the gas price. And if we took that out of the price formation for electricity, nobody would have a gas boiler. We'd all move to electric heat pumps as quickly as they could be installed. So that's a big lesson, because heat pumps are intrinsically much, much more efficient. You get much more heat out for the energy you put in than gas, which gives you less than 100%, much, much less than 100% of heat for the gas you put in. But we have this distortion, this market distortion. So storage and how you construct your market pricing can both help with this dependency, but be aware you need to have diverse sources of supply, be that for the gas or be that for the sources of energy that are running your electricity sector. And you need storage, and you need to manage peaks and seasonality.
I think indeed it's important to mention, as you say, that the UK, even previous to 2022, was way less reliant on Russian gas than, for instance, the EU. And even though the UK seems to have made already a move for diversification in the early 2000s, Germany, for instance, still decided to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the 2010s. So I think there was also the slightly different strategies, maybe between the UK and EU countries. But what I please go ahead.
And actually, I mean, I had several exchanges with colleagues on this, German colleagues. I was chair of the IA governing board. The EU had the UK had the presidency of the EU, so I was leading the energy work stream there at official level, and we talked to them, but their consistent reply was that Russia needed to sell the gas as much as we needed to buy it. Well, actually, I don't need to finish the sentence.
No, indeed, and actually it was something which we had discussed with the previous guest the last time, who said that there was for a very long time a Russia first policy in European foreign affairs, but let's leave that.
Yeah. And by the way, UK was bought into it. We had a lot of work with Russia in the early 2000s. We had an MOU with them. We did a lot of joint work. They asked us to share with them some of our policy thinking, so it was a good relationship while it was good.
And now, like we touch upon Russian gas and the reliance, and then we can put together the pieces also with the previous episode if you want to watch it. And At the moment, one of the consequences of disconnecting from the Russian gas from a new perspective is an increase in imports of US liquefied natural gas that passed from a share of around 27% pre-war levels to now 45%, so a very important increase in overall liquefied natural gas imports. But looking at the cost, the US liquefied natural gas has two things. First of all, it's almost four times more expensive than Russian gas as pre-war levels. And second, is more subject to market volatility. So if there are natural events, for example, that can impact the supply, the prices can skyrocket. And on the other end, like we know clearly that the disposable income on energy is on the low middle class more. Clearly, no, they have more of their income that depends on these surges in cost and prices. So two things here: we are diversifying to an energy source that is more expensive to us economically. And the EU measures such as the Social Climate Fund, they do not account for this increase in this diversification of gas. And second, are we moving towards strategic autonomy in this way? So I think there are two possible things to consider there.
Well, just on the LNG, I mean, the answer actually is to reduce your supply, your dependence on gas, you know, and it's essentially space heating for us, or some power generation. So it's got to be, you know, a much reduced contributor to the electricity mix, and that is happening. And I've just made the point about gas heating. But I'd make 2 points on the US versus the Russian position. It's all LNG, so you don't have the downsides of some of those very constricted contract terms that you had with Russia. And secondly, maybe people would think, well, you know, Russia turned out not to be a wholly reliable supplier. Why not the US going the same way? I think it's different because the Russian gas, although Gazprom was supposed to be outside the Russian state, it was part of the Russians. It is part of the Russian state. People used to talk about it being a state within a state. In America, you've got all these companies. Okay, now, would America take action to stop exports? It has in the past. But as long as America is adequately supplied domestically, I don't really see America taking action to stop exports, because they would see that as in their economic interest, and I don't think a geopolitical interest could override it. I mean, maybe if Europe declared war on America, they might take a different view. But you know, I'm going to stick my neck out and say I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. I probably don't think it's going to happen in your lifetime either. So I think the situation is different. But you made an important point there, which is about autonomy. And I really think we need to talk about autonomy generally. We've hinted at it in relation to the military issue. As we move down to the clean transition, could we maybe talk about that? I think you're interested in some aspects of that.
Absolutely. You want to say something now on that, or?
Yeah, well, I think.
Yeah,
do
please.
You think?
Please go
ahead.
Yeah.
We mustn't trade dependence on Russia or other petrostates or gas markets for dependence on essentially China for critical minerals, and China and others in relation to the technologies that are, the foundation of the clean transition. People will be tempted to think it's all going to get much quieter, and the LNG market looks as if it's going to be very well supplied in a year, so maybe we slow down. But you've still got that climate change clock ticking away. you've still got the need for new technology, good quality jobs in the clean energy space. And we exported a lot of our manufacturing capacity to China and to other emerging and developing countries. We must not do that with the technologies for the clean energy transition, and we must think very strategically about the sources of the minerals and rare earth elements that are a core part of the goods that are needed and the equipment that is needed for the clean transition. So I think a general point on that is that China exercising its leverage is not just theoretical. They've already done it. They will do it if they think it's in their own interest, and the consequences could be very severe. I think the two cases are slightly distinct. I mean, the clean technologies, I would say we need to be autonomous in because of how key they are to prosperity and our competitiveness and our social cohesion. And if we give that up, we'll lose not just what we've got now, but, you know, their future evolution. And we need to be masters of our own fate on that for all those reasons and for addressing climate change. But in relation to the minerals and the rare earth elements, at the moment, and everybody knows this now, I think, China is more or less completely dominant. They have been very far-sighted in their strategy in acquiring sources of these minerals and rare earth elements. And they have been very far-sighted in developing the technologies and building the capabilities to process them in China. Mm-hmm. They're not rare. These things, we call them rare earth elements, but they're not. They're quite widely dispersed across the globe, but China has been very strategic in investing and getting control. And in addition, I would say the developed world, certainly Europe and the US, has been a little bit, that's really mining and it's not very nice activity. And so we've stood aloof from what needed to be done to mine those sources where we have them, or even in other countries. And we should be thinking of partnerships with countries which have them, because actually these people should not be solely dependent on China for the income from exploiting their natural resource advantages. I believe that Europe could be a trusted partner, that it would be liable to hold itself to higher standards of environmental performance and taking into account social justice, to sharing the benefits with emerging or developing countries who have these resources. And for that reason, we should not regard this as somehow distasteful. We should regard it as part of development done under the right conditions and with the right intent to secure mutual benefit, both for our economy and the exporting countries' economy, and for the clean transition. So those partnerships, I think we've got to get better at developing. We have a lot to offer. We have big mining companies. We have great engineering capability in mining equipment in Germany, and we have we have mining companies listed in the UK, and UK and France in particular are financial hubs for this sector, are good sources of finance. And of course we've got the EBRD and the EIB as offering development or development-linked finance for this. So we should be thinking of securing the sources of those supply, and we need to build that up. Separately from that, we need to tackle the whole processing issue, and that is challenging, because at the moment the finance doesn't flow to alternatives, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is stricter environmental standards. I mean, frankly, China can do this much more cheaply than anybody else. They might argue that's because they have built up the expertise, and there'll be something in that. They would argue that they are prepared to work harder, there may be something in that. But above all, I don't think, I have a real question mark, and I suspect there's quite a lot of evidence in support of this proposition that they're just not applying stringent enough environmental standards. So, frankly, we should be putting this work onto a more respectable footing, and we should be doing it in our countries or trusted third countries. And we need to take an end-to-end approach to this, which will require a very clear strategy about how we do it and what's most urgent first. And it involves quite a lot of different elements. I've mentioned the finance. One of the reasons that the financing isn't flowing, the investment isn't flowing, is not that there isn't money there. The European Initiative on Energy Security, and I should declare an interest here, they have an Energy Security Leadership Council, and I'm privileged to be a member of that, along with some very eminent Europeans. But they have convened a roundtable discussion jointly with the Royal United Services Institute, which is the leading defence think tank in the UK, in London. And there's a paper in preparation from that event, which I'm hoping will issue in a couple of weeks' time. But they had their C-suite people from the banks, EIB and others. And the strong message was, there is the money, but it's not going to flow while you can have predatory pricing from a single supplier to keep market share. It's not going to flow while you have uncertainties about market demand, and market demand at the price at which the market can deliver if we invest. So there's a big role for government there. It can give seed finance, but by and large, the main financing is going to need to come from the finance houses or via the combination of the finance houses and the corporates who are active in this sector. And it needs to look at the creation of the market and the delivery of these crucial elements to Europe as a whole and to OECD members generally, and like-minded emerging and developing economies. There is something more that I'd like to say on this, and that is that we, in bringing this to market, as well as the strengths I've mentioned, investors like to invest where they can rely on the rule of law and the quality and stability of policy and regulation. For 6 years, I led work for the World Energy Council on what became known as the World Energy Trilemma, an annual assessment of countries' policies against the criteria of security, affordability, and economic impact. The key message that came out from that period, when we interviewed governments, finance houses, energy companies, the single overriding message was it wasn't about whether something was privatized or in the public sector or whether one specific policy worked. It was about the overall trustworthiness of the policy and regulatory framework. And that was so powerful, and Europe has that. That is such a great asset, and we should really understand that, and it should give us confidence. We shouldn't think that we can't achieve what we need to achieve in this space.
Yeah. I think you mentioned a lot of interesting different aspects when it comes especially to critical raw materials needed for the clean technologies, and indeed we should separate between the mining, so the extraction, then going over to the processing. At the moment, as you mentioned, there is a huge reliance on China. I think in many sectors it's over 95% or more. And you said that the China was very strategically engaging in partnerships with third countries. Just a couple of months ago, I actually read a book about the cobalt extraction in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is heavily dominated by Chinese companies. And so I think my follow-up question here would be, if Europe aims to have a higher degree of sovereignty in critical raw materials, of course, maybe a certain degree can be done in Europe also with mining and processing, but to a certain extent we will have to rely on what we call trusted partners. And since for investment in those countries it's so important that the rule of law framework is strong, how can we ensure a stability between fostering a strong rule of law in those third countries and still engaging in a win-win economic partnership?
Well, that's really such a strong point that you raise. People have a range of partnerships, and it has been argued that because in the past countries like the European countries, including UK, have been seen as lecturing or dictating to some of these emerging and developing countries on human rights or environmental standards or whatever. China's had an advantage because it hasn't done that, and it's often seemed to offer a lot more upfront in terms of upfront benefit. I get that. But on the other hand, as countries develop and they've got one partnership going and so they've got some sources of income, maybe they go up the value chain in terms of what is a good contract for them. And then maybe they begin to think, be more receptive to issues around environmental impact, mm-hmm. or treatment of workers or whatever. Now, that doesn't involve lecturing. That involves a very strong focus on developing a common understanding and an approach which is seen as beneficial ultimately for the country, which has the resource. And I think it's a mistake to assume that every country is in exactly the same starting position here. We have seen some terrific progress on specific aspects of policy in different African countries. Kenya has been showing significant leadership in the UN climate negotiations. I don't know how much of a partner they would be on this particular aspect, but equally, we ought to be working with like-minded countries where we can. We ought to be thinking in terms of how we can present the proposal or the proposition or the offer, whatever you like, in a way that is attractive to the would-be partner. And we need to think about the strength of African institutions. You know, Africa has the African Development Bank, they've got the Organisation for African Unity, and these are powerful sources of peer pressure across Africa. And we are not the only people with working institutions. So that doesn't deal with all of the issues, but with an intelligent approach to partnership development, starting with areas which are perhaps more straightforward and then moving into some of the more complex issues, I think we can get there. The key enemy here is time, because the more we go up the value chain on the technologies in the clean transition, the more we're dependent on these materials, critical minerals or rare earths. And we need to get this right before that dependency becomes embedded. So I would say this is a really urgent priority for the EU. Things are moving. We know there's been action in Brussels. We know there's been action in London. We know there is significant action in the US, including a rather unprecedented investment of government money in a private company which called Mountain Pass, which is producing some of the key materials with unpronounceable names. But that has not been uncontroversial in the US, but it was led by the Department of Defense. And that brings me to another point, which is this is not only key for the clean transition, it's key for our military autonomy. And the defence demand here, where government has possibly more direct levers in relation to the level of demand and how it's managed, can act as an anchor customer. And that comes back to the point I was making earlier about the market evolution and how you give confidence in the market. So you've got to have awareness of this across the civil sector and the military sector.
Yeah. And in this regard, the European Union possibly offering more advantageous contracts in terms of environmental norms and also social workers' right protection. Do you think are we missing an opportunity there to be leaders and also to exploit this window of opportunity that can benefit Europe as a whole? For example, being more competitive, for example, vis-a-vis China in offering this country more advantageous contracts. And also here I want to come back to a point that the EU and the fight on climate change can be won just in cooperation, because the EU as a whole, and also if we put together the UK, we have a share that is very minoritarian, less than 10% of global emissions, around 7%. So we really need to ensure that our efforts are not, in brackets, vain, that we have a leverage on other countries, also African countries that are going to have, for example, Nigeria, almost 1 billion population in the next decades, so, to have the capacity of influencing their environmental policy in the right direction. So do you think the EU can really be a leader on this?
Absolutely. And I think I hope you don't mind me saying this, but our share of emissions is a slight we call it a red herring, a distraction, because herrings aren't red, so they don't exist. And the reason I say that, joking apart, is that we also have a historic responsibility. So that adds to the case for us showing leadership. And I'm talking about the UK as well as the EU. But, you know, there's another point here. We've talked already about the overall benefits, socioeconomic, military, the whole autonomy around fully committing to the clean transition. But there's another issue, which is a lot of global corporates are either based in Europe or operate in Europe. Now, I don't know quite the simplest way to put this, but when a company sees how it can deliver on high standards in one jurisdiction, and that it is at worst neutral for the bottom line and may even be very, very beneficial, then that's what it adopts. There is no penalty for outperforming the minimum standards in other jurisdictions. I leave aside the current political, it's the opposite of greenwashing, if you know what I mean, in America. I think that will settle down, and a lot of corporates have just coped with it by not being very loud in what they're doing, but they're carrying on with their investments because that's where their fiduciary duty lies to their shareholders. Now, if you've got Europe, which I think I'm right in saying, if it take it as a whole, and certainly with the UK as a whole, is the second biggest economy on the globe, then actually that's a great influencer of what your standards are going to be. You know, you tool up your production to produce a recyclable bottle or whatever for the European market, and you find that it's cheaper to transport and are you going to keep separate lower standards just for the sake of it somewhere else? Maybe in a transitional phase, but that leadership pull in terms of best technology, best available technology, innovation, that really is very powerful in relation to companies, and global companies, that's where they go. I like to just dial back a bit because, you know, in the mid-2000s, Detroit and the US automotive industry was in a very poor position. And they were working under fuel efficiency standards, fossil fuel efficiency standards, which were much looser than in Europe, and they were not in a good place. Well, when the great financial crisis occurred in 2008, the support which the US government gave to the automotive sector was conditional on them improving their performance on fuel efficiency. I believe that rescued the automotive sector from a global perspective in the US, because while what they call gas, we call petrol, was so lightly taxed and much cheaper in the US, the European and Japanese penetration of the market was going up because they had models that used less. And why wouldn't you as a consumer, you know, buy that, if only to avoid having to go and fill up your car quite so frequently? So, you know, best practice, innovation in this space that is beneficial to your bottom line, beneficial to your customers, is a huge driver. And I actually think Europe can be incredibly important in showing the art of the possible, and the fact that the art of the possible is also the art of the economically possible, the economically advantageous.
And I think what you described here is somehow captured by what an author, Anu Bradford, describes as the Brussels effect, right? So there are certain standards which are adopted first in Europe and then have some spillover effects in other economies. But I would like to now move over a bit to the merely economic competitiveness elements of the energy prices. And last year, you know that Mario Draghi published his very important report on European competitiveness. And one element he mentioned as a major obstacle to future growth were the high energy prices, and he mentioned especially for SME and energy intensive industries. Can you give us a view from your perspective how important energy prices are for maintaining Europe's competitiveness, and maybe also which sectors in particular?
Well, I think they are important. I think acting on the Draghi report is one of the best things Europe could do. And clearly, the energy-intensive sectors, you know, your chemicals and what have you, are the most exposed, and therefore, if they are in direct competition, then, you know, they're going to be disadvantaged. But, and here comes a big but, you come back to things like energy efficiency, and things like the clean transition, where you take out the dependence on world prices and you start implementing widespread deployment of the clean technologies, which are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You know, oil and gas, getting them out of the ground, I mean, there are developments now, but they mostly don't make it that much cheaper. They mostly are necessary because you're moving to basins which are intrinsically more expensive because you've taken most of the low-hanging fruit and you're into deep offshore or whatever. Whereas these technologies, they're coming down in price all the time. And as we enter a world where carbon is priced at the border, and that's been a free ride for the fossil fuels, then these become more and more competitive, and they become more central to economic competitiveness. So I just think that is, there are lots of things you could do on competitiveness, and some of them are crucial to the clean energy transition anyway. We've talked about standardization. We haven't talked a lot about R&D and encouraging innovation per se, but that's at the heart, and we probably haven't got time to go into that as much. But you know, just this very strategic approach from governments individually at the Brussels level and across the European continent is crucial. One thing we haven't mentioned, which goes to the critical minerals and the rare earths, but also across the competitiveness landscape, is the whole recycling piece. You know, it doesn't give you the answer on areas where resources are scarce, but if you can get the business model right, it takes cost out, it takes emissions out, and people like it. You know, if I give you a choice of a recycled bottle of water and a non-recycled, you know which you're going to buy. And this is increasingly the approach. So I don't think economic competitiveness and innovation, and I've probably said this too many times, is incompatible with the clean transition. I think it's central to it. And I don't think the clean transition is incompatible with security, either militarily or security of supply or geopolitically. I think these things are completely interlinked.
Yeah, and one aspect indeed of competitiveness is the importance of the EU becoming more an innovator. And on clean technology, I also see that there is really the opportunity of becoming also a leader in something that can really make us more competitive and also having an edge. But entrepreneurial, from an entrepreneurship perspective, the most difficult part of innovating is the start. No, so that there is the risk of losing your investment. So there is really where the EU should support. So do you think in terms of economic policy, is the EU supporting enough entrepreneurs that wants to innovate in clean technologies, or can we do more to support them?
Yes, we can do more. You can always do more, but I think I would slightly want to come back to you on this issue of the starting up. I think the big challenge in Europe and the UK is scaling up. We have a lot of the scientific innovation, we have a lot of the R&D innovation. You know, we're not as rich as America in terms of our top 100 university positioning, but we've got significant presence there, and combined, it's well worth having. You know, I mean, the UK has 3 in the top 10 or something, and Germany has terrific strengths in engineering, Italy in design. You know, there is a huge amount of scientific and technical resource in Europe. It's being augmented by the attack on academic freedom in the US as we see talent crossing the Atlantic. I hope that the US will see how important that has been to the success of the US as a country, and how much that has helped pull global prosperity along. But for the time being, we welcome the opportunity to get a piece of that pie. And what we need to do is work much harder at translating the initial ideas into scalable, deployable and deployed technologies. And I mean, there are, I think Germany's always been a bit better at this than some other countries. I think they've been better at it than the UK with the Fraunhofer institutes and so forth. But the UK has been working hard on this, and it has set up some specific mechanisms for taking innovation from the universities into the commercialization. We still are not good enough at risk capital, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK has been making speeches about this and is trying to push for it. And I think at European level, that's an area where we need to work harder on deepening our pools of capital, making them more liquid, making them more accessible, and having more risk appetite. And I think that's partly what Draghi and also the other parallel report about the financial sector in the EU are about, and we really ought to focus on those.
And I think in this regard, there has already been some developments at the EU level with the startup and scale-up strategy, but also with increased reliance on what we call the joint undertakings and the industrial alliances, which essentially are partnerships between public sector institutions, research institutions, the finance sector, and the business sector. I'm wondering, could you elaborate a bit on how important it is to have these interlinkages between public and private sectors to make innovation happen?
Well, you know, it's very interesting to look back on this. I spent 35 years in government, then I spent 5 years in business, and then I spent 6 years with the World Energy Council trying to improve the dialogue and the exchanges between them. And my observation on that would be that there are things the public sector must do, and only they can do, and there are things they are very, very good at, you know, and we have some great public sector employees in the UK and in European countries. But there are things they don't have, and there are things that the private sector brings that are just crucial. And one thing, and this is one of the reasons I worked on the dialogue for so long, is that, you know, the understanding of new technologies and how they will fare in the market tends to be better in the private sector. The policy understanding of why they're needed and, you know, the actual science, I mean, that's there in government, but how they're going to be sustainable in the market is a private sector judgment. Private sector is much better at handling risk. Well, it is at handling commercial risk. I mean, non-commercial risk, there are things the public sector does that it does very well, and, you know, the military and disaster recovery and all of that stuff. But the private sector is the only place where you can really handle entrepreneurial risk. And so they need to iterate with the public sector in terms of helping them to understand which are the avenues to go down. And then they take a judgment about, well, the risk-reward equation stacks up for us to put capital behind this. And then their judgment about resource allocation to deploy that capital and how to make it work is crucial. And what they're particularly good at is two things. The first is, if something's not working, they're much quicker to realise that and cut their losses. The institutional factors operating against that in government are very significant, because the politician who identifies it gets all the blame for it. And the civil servants advising the politician are understandably cautious on this. And I don't want to give examples, but believe me, I do have experience of some of these decisions. In the private sector, provided you get more things right than wrong, your bottom line thrives, and your shareholders are happy. And you just have to work on improving that ratio. But the shareholders don't beat up on you every single time you get something wrong, because they know if they do that, they're with a declining company. You know, so these are the complementary skills that we need to try to join up in the best way. And one other point that I would observe is that, you know, if I look back, I spent a lot of my time in the criminal justice world before I moved into energy and climate. Now, the theory on all of that and the practice on it and, you know, penal policy and criminology go back hundreds of years. The practice on energy and climate policy and transition policy is some decades. Now, where you have the 200-year legacy, if you will, you have a very mature ecosystem, both in terms of policy, in terms of the general understanding and so forth. In energy and the clean transition, I think this is still relatively immature, and it will mature over time, but I come back to the fact that we haven't got time, because the climate clock doesn't recognise that. It's still ticking. So trying to accelerate that mutual understanding and the sophistication of the interactions between the public and the private sector in this space is a very, very worthwhile thing to do, and it's a crucial thing to do.
And I think we touch upon in this episode very interesting aspects and about energy policy and security. But I would like just to come back to something that was mentioned before, to make the audience understand that maybe there is a myth that needs to be debunked, in the sense that the EU is often seen as very focused on environmental practice, environmental regulation, social rights, and putting into place the best conditions possible in contracts, also companies' contracts, also vis-a-vis third country, in partnership with third countries. And you mentioned a very important point, that this can be an advantage, not just from a social perspective to the countries with which you do partnership, but also economically. So if you can just elaborate a bit on this, like being environmentally solid and aware, and also socially aware in terms of workers' rights, can be an economic advantage. So this is also a myth that is something very important to say, because in the discourse, I believe that is often seen this as a disadvantage economically. So if you can elaborate a bit on this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I would say two things about it. The first is it's terribly easy to promote that myth. It's unnecessary cost, you're getting in the way of good business, and we don't need this. And that's fine until something really goes badly wrong because the environmental regulation was poor, or the other regulation was deficient. Come back to the pressure in China on pollution, and that now is a very strong commitment on environmental issues from what hadn't been the best base, when you have contamination of the water or the baby formula, so that they had to place restrictions on the import of baby formula from New Zealand and Australia, because nobody would buy the baby formula in China. So it's all fine to say this is optional until it's clear why it's needed. So you have to have regulation, and that leads to the second point, which is that the regulation has to be fit for purpose. So it has to achieve what it's trying to achieve without unnecessary elaboration and cost and burdens. And actually, the more you focus on what is the outcome and how is it best to achieve it, the more effective it will be. And actually, the more you can do away with being distracted by what appears to be the right way of doing it. This is where public-private iteration is crucial, because if you talk to companies, they will say, well, yes, we see why you're trying to do that, but actually the proposal you've made is not particularly the best proposal, or it may be a good proposal, but you could do it in a much more efficient way that keeps cost out for everybody, including consumers. So I think if there is a criticism of Brussels occasionally, and I hope everything I've said in this conversation is that I'm in favour of the European Union, and I think the Commission does a huge amount of great work, but it is that sometimes it can over-elaborate. And I think that this is recognised, and there are now attempts at simplification. They should not be seen as purely a way to appease companies. This is actually about how to get the best outcome for everybody across Europe. And so a very clear focus on the ultimate goal and the outcome, and a clear focus on what used to be called subsidiarity, I don't know whether it's still called that, about what needs an EU level intervention and what can properly be done at a country level or even a subnational level, actually, is good, because the closer it gets to where the problem is and where the solution needs to be, then the more it can adapt to changing circumstances and to ensuring it's as effective as possible. And so I would say, and we talked about this a little bit already, things like harmonisation, things like harmonisation driven by, well, hang on a minute, we're all trying to achieve the same things here. There might need to be some variation there for local reasons. Actually, this one has huge benefits if it's the same across the whole place, is right. And, one needs to be very, very careful that people don't become over-enthusiastic in the public sector about this is my area which I am going to get right at every last detail, because that becomes proprietorial, and it's not, you are not the owner. The owner of that is the citizen and the consumer, or the company that's operating in your jurisdiction. And so that is the area where you need to focus. And I think there are examples where, Brussels hasn't always got that right. There are lots of examples where London hasn't always got that right. So this is not critical of the union. But in the public sector, there is a tendency always to want to get the perfect solution, when sometimes the 90% solution is the best solution when you take into account all of the factors.
Joan, to slowly conclude, maybe to get to our last and traditional question, which we pose to every guest, since our podcast is called Moving Europe, we always ask our guests how they could and propose to move Europe forward. So in our case, we would like to ask you, if you had one shot, how would you propose to move the future of European energy politics in the right direction? And also, how can our listeners in their individual and everyday life contribute to this goal?
Thank you. I think we've talked about the unpredictability of the world we're in, and indeed the existential challenges. And the challenge for the policymakers to deal with that is bigger than I ever remember in my time in government. And my answer to it is that we must redouble our efforts on the clean transition, because that is the route to energy security, as well as to economic prosperity. But we must do it in a way that takes full account of the security angle now. So I think the policymakers should be thinking about this from the lens of how do we integrate the defence and energy priorities, and how do we take advantage of the synergies that exist between those two, if I can call them sectors, to increase the overall benefit. And so the EU, UK and Norway, I think, need to work together on some of these issues around resilience, both onshore and offshore, and both physical and technical, to minimise our external dependencies, not just in it's better made here, but in the sense of what we're striving for is an achievable and appropriate level of autonomy in the interests of our public. So I think I come back to the last question, which is let's strengthen the institutional coordination frameworks within the EU and the EU and the member states, between the EU and the rest of Europe, and actually with the whole of Europe and with NATO, working not just with the policymakers, but with industry and particularly energy developers, and with our military planners.
And to conclude, indeed, thanks a lot, but for citizens in their daily life?
Oh, yes, of course. I think citizens who agree with this should be making that known to their representatives, because the representatives usually get told when people don't like things, which reduces the incentive to do the right thing, but also citizens who get this, who understand both the imperative and the power of the clean transition in the way we've been talking about it, need to pull on this end of the rope, because there are vested interests pulling on that end. And they need to pull on this end of the rope so that the policymakers can get it right. You know, it's tempting to say we should all switch the lights off or recycle our bottles or anything else. We actually need the policy frameworks and the industrial and commercial ecosystem to enable us to do the right thing. We can all do individual things, that's fine, but we need those frameworks. And we need to make it clear that we support our policymakers, our companies, in getting those frameworks right.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Joan. Very good episode, and thanks to our listeners.
Thank
See
you
you.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Our pleasure.